Thank you for tuning into Literary Blend, a publishing podcast. I'm your host, Demi Michelle Schwartz. There's no perfect recipe for chasing a dream in the publishing industry, but I hope the conversations on this show give you the ingredients you need to bake yours into reality. So let's flip the page and get into this chapter of Literary Blend. Hello friends, welcome back to Literary Blend. Today's chapter is called Tackling First Drafts. And joining me on the show is someone I'm so excited to have a chat with. Please welcome debut author Mitra De Souza. Hi Mitra.
Hi, I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. So I'm so excited to chat with you all about first drafts. But before we do that, I would love for you to share a little about yourself and your journey as a writer so far.
Okay, yeah, I've always loved to write. Like as soon as I was old enough to write, I wrote. So I used to write short stories when I was little, and it was just always something I did just for me. And so I never, I didn't take any classes in writing or anything like that. I just did it because I loved it. And so that's really my process is just writing for the love of it, and then saying, "Hey, I'd like to publish. What do I do?" And then that big learning curve was there. But I'd say writing's always been a part of my life since I was little. I love reading and I love writing.
Yeah, I feel like that's very common. I feel like all of us started from loving books when we were younger and loving those creative writing activities in school. And then look at us now, we're authors. So I think that's a
Definitely.
very common story.
Yeah.
How did you feel when you got your pub deal from Wild Ink?
Oh my gosh, I was so excited because when I wrote it, like I didn't know what I was doing. And we'll probably talk about more later, but like I wrote it and then I spent a really long time editing, revising as I learned like everything I didn't know. And the querying process was really intense. And so when I got my publishing deal, I was just so happy because my goal when I started is I wanted to hold my book in my hand. And I've held my book in my hand and it's an amazing feeling.
Aw, I cannot wait till that happens for me. Congratulations. I'm so
Thank
excited for
you.
you.
Thanks.
Awesome. So let's dive into our chat about first drafts. And I think this is a very fun topic just because we all have to write first drafts, whether we're writing poetry, short stories, novels, novellas, we're all starting at the same place, whether we are plotters or pantsers. And so for you, do you prefer the drafting process or revising?
Well, that's a really good question. So when I first started, I really loved the drafting process because I just wrote out of my head and I was inspired and I was writing and I didn't have that little inner critic in my ear. So I think when I wrote my first novel, I really appreciated the freedom with the first draft. But I think subsequently, when I learned all the things I didn't know, and then my little inner critic started getting louder, the first draft process has gotten a lot harder. And so I think I actually like both equally because I love editing other people's work. Like I love beta reading, I love, giving feedback. And I do like the challenge. Like if someone says, "Hey, I see a flaw in this," and then I get kind of excited and creative, how am I going to fix this? So honestly, I think I kind of like both, but for different reasons.
Yeah, I feel like you and I are the same. When I started, I was just very excited to write a new story without really thinking about how it could be better and just get in that imaginative headspace. But after writing multiple books and being an editor as well, my brain is like constantly in editing mode. Even when I'm drafting, it's like, oh no, you have a word echo here, you got to get it out. Or, oh no, like you don't have interiority here, you got to put it in. And it's just like, really hard for me, especially to turn it off. And so that's something I need to make an effort of while I'm drafting to not let myself get in editor mode because it takes the fun out of it.
Oh, totally. And I heard someone say like our creative brain, our editor brain can't work at the same time. So like
Yeah.
if your brain is being creative, your editor brain is like interfering with your
Yeah.
creative brain.
So would you consider yourself to be a plotter or a pantser?
I'm definitely a pantster. And I know like that's not always the preferred way, but I tried. So like after I wrote my first book and then I read like Save the Cat Writes a novel and I got all excited and I was going to plot my next book and I started doing it and I couldn't. So like I can have a general idea of where I want my story to go, but if I really try to block out like scene by scene what's going to happen, I just can't. And part of the fun for me of writing is not knowing what's going to happen next. And all of a sudden I'll be writing and all of a sudden like a character will do something that I wasn't imagining they would do, but it's awesome. So I feel like that's where my creativity comes from is just allowing the ideas just to kind of flow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel like when I started writing, I was definitely a pantser because I didn't know how to plot, and now I'm definitely a plotter. I plot my short stories even. I just enjoy that, but I think it's really cool how you gave plotting a try and you realized it wasn't for you. And I think even if you are a plotter or a pantser, I think writing a first draft can be daunting because I could have a whole chapter by chapter outline and I would still be like stressed out to start drafting, even though I know what the story is going to be.
Yeah, and I think with me, part of what helps me be a pantser is because I do like the editing process. So, like, it's okay if I end up with something that's not very good the first time because then I know I can fix it. And I just when I'm like what we talked about earlier, if I'm in that editor mode or in that mode, it makes me stuck. Like my second book that I've been working on now, when I first started writing that, it was like taking me forever. Like I was taking months and I'd only written like a few chapters. Whereas, like previously, I wrote my first draft like in 3 months of a novel. But it's just because I kept criticizing myself and thinking, like what you said, is that the wrong word? Is my prose strong enough? All this kind of stuff. And I'm like, I just need to get the draft out. But it's so hard to get the draft out when you have that critical mind interfering with the
Yeah,
process.
for sure. No, I totally agree. And the other thing too is remembering, like you said, that you can revise it. That's one of the main things that I have to keep in mind. But I do edit as I go. And I know some people do this, some people are like, how can you possibly do that? But the way I work is like I typically draft in chapters. And so whenever I finish a chapter, if I sit down the next day to write the next chapter, I will always read the previous one and clean it up first, just because it's easier for me to stay on track and make sure the story is consistent. Like, if for some reason I would deviate from my outline at one point and that would affect something earlier in the book, I always go back and fix it because my brain the entire time will be like, to me, you gotta go back and fix this, you gotta fix it, and then I can't focus. And so I am an edit as I go person, which helps when I'm drafting because as I'm drafting, I'm seeing the story improve by going back and fixing the chapter before moving on. And so that's a way for me to keep pushing through it whenever I'm like, this is bad, but wait, no, I can fix it.
Oh, yeah. No, I totally get that, and what I'll do is I won't necessarily fix it, but I'll write a note, like, in the comments,
Yeah.
"Fix this." So, like, when I come I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I just wrote this, and this affects 3 more things," so I'll put, like, a note to myself, "Go back and make sure that this, is makes sense throughout the rest of the book."
Yeah. So aside from sitting at that blank page and thinking that, oh my goodness, I can write crap, but wait, I gotta revise it, are there any other things that make you feel nervous and stressed to start a first draft?
Yeah, I think again for me it's that inner critic. And I think because when I kind of made the shift from writing from for me to writing for like being published and going through that querying process and seeing how agents are so hyper specific of what they want. And so like, sitting that page, is this gonna sell? Is someone gonna like this? Is it gonna, are people gonna relate to the characters? So I think like all those questions get in my head. And it's really hard sometimes to shut those out. But I think for me in my process, I have to do that. Otherwise, I do get really stuck.
No, that makes total sense, and I completely relate. I feel like now when I'm writing new stories, I am obviously writing stories that I want to write, but I also have this mindset of I do want to sell this, and so I'm more mindful of will this be marketable and all those things. So I totally relate to the inner critic in terms of the publishing business, not necessarily just the writing itself. And one more thing that I wanted to add that holds me back a little bit is because I have written multiple manuscripts and a bunch of short stories and have revised those over and over and over again, I have seen my work polished. And so it's difficult for me to start sometimes because I have this fear like what if I'm unable to finish this book? What if I don't do it justice? What if I completely mess this up and my vision for it isn't what it was meant to be, and like all these things. And so I feel like because I've seen my work polished and I've seen my finished books, it's almost like, can I do this again? And I always do, but that's still something that gets in my head when I'm about to start a new project.
Oh, definitely. I feel the same way. And sometimes it helps me to like go back and think about books I read and like, you know what, that wasn't perfect. Like I really enjoyed this book and it was great and I couldn't put it down, but yeah, I could find something wrong with it if I needed to, you know? So like I think we have this idea that everything has to be perfect, but nothing really is like
Yeah.
completely perfect.
No, I completely agree 100%. So, as we're drafting, I'm curious, do you find writing the beginning, the middle, or the end the hardest?
I think the middle, because I usually, when I get inspired with an idea, like I totally know like how it's going to start and how it's going to end. But then the middle, sometimes for me is a problem, like to keep that action going and keep the intensity and keep the reader turning pages. So definitely, like there's a book I'm drafting right now, and I'm kind of stuck in the middle because I know where I want to go at the ending, but I just am kind of stuck in the weeds right now in the middle of it. So definitely, that's the hardest part for me.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's common for pantsers too, because you get to that
Yeah.
middle and it's like, wait, where do I go now? I can go here, 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 here. For me, because I have a plot outline, the beginning is hardest for me. Once I get into the middle and I get into the flow of things, I'm good. Sometimes ending it is a little difficult just because it's like, oh my gosh, this is the end. I need to like do this perfect. And so sometimes I would like procrastinate writing the last chapter or whatever. But for me, it's the beginning. And I think it's because it takes me a while to really get into the story and know my characters and their voice and all of the things. And I've noticed as well when I get feedback, like from my agent or like other people, it's always like the beginning. Like I would say like the first third of the book, maybe closer to the midpoint. Anything from after the midpoint is typically solid. It's usually that beginning where it's like these like plot points need to be planted more clearly, or you have like pacing issues at the beginning, we need to get into it faster. And so I've just noticed from my own work and getting feedback that typically most of my issues are at the beginning, and I think that tracks because I struggle to get started, and then once I get started I have a flow.
Yeah, I totally see that, and I think someone told me once, like, your beginning's always gonna change. So, like,
All the
I just
time.
write the beginning, and then I know my beginning changed so many times later
Yeah.
on. And it's also funny because I had a character when I wrote, The Fragile, my debut novel that just came out, is and in it, there was a character that I didn't really have big plans for. So when I first introduced him, he was just kinda like this guy, you know, that was playing part of a role, and then later on, he became such a major character in the book, I had to kind of go back and rewrite when he was introduced because when I first wrote about him, he was not at all the person who he ended up becoming at the end of the book. So I had to kind of go back and totally rewrite where I introduced him because I'd had a lot better idea of what his personality was and things like that when I first wrote it, I didn't really have him that fleshed out.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense, and I've definitely had experiences with that too. I find typically when I'm drafting, I'm focusing more of getting the story, like the structural, developmental, like scene structure, like good. And then when I go back through, that's when I really focus on like the sensory descriptions and like the internal thoughts and emotion and the characterization. I find that in my first drafts, my characters aren't as developed, and so I totally understand of like having a character who needed more development, needed to be planted earlier in the story and made a bigger part of the story. I've definitely had those experiences as well.
Yeah, because when I went back and read, I'm like, "In this first scene, that's not even his personality." So I had to go back and, like, change, like, what he said and how he carried it
Yeah.
to really match with how his personality and I know some folks do these really elaborate, like, character sketches before they write and stuff, but I think so much for me, the first draft is such a discovery process, that a lot of times the characters end up, you know, changing and developing and things like that, and to me, that's part of the fun of it.
Yeah. No, I definitely don't do the in-depth character sketches. When I was in my MFA program, I had to do one like for my thesis novel, and I just discovered then that it wasn't really for me because I can go into a book like, for example, one of my fantasies, when I went into it, I thought my protagonist would be like very serious and shy and like timid and stuff, but she ended up having like a very sassy side to her as well. And whenever I was plotting the book, I didn't think that she would have like some attitude to her.
Ah.
And I discovered that when I started writing it. And so I completely agree with the characters. Like I love discovering the characters and what they're like during the drafting process. So I don't do the character sketches either.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So, as you're approaching the end of a draft, if you hit those points where you're struggling to cross the finish line, what are some tips do you have for getting to the end of the book?
Yeah, and one thing this is just a goes alongside of that, not necessarily the ending, but what I learned that's something that works for me too is sometimes if I stop writing at like the end of a chapter or like the end of what I know going to happen, then sometimes a little bit harder for me to go back to it. So sometimes like I'll deliberately stop right before I finish like a chapter or right before I finish something because then when I go back, I have that motivation because like I know what's going to happen next, and I just need to write it, and then that like continues me on into the next section. Because sometimes I'll get to a point where it's like, okay, I wrote this and I don't know what's going to happen next, and so when I come back to it, I feel like kind of stuck. So sometimes I like to leave it where I come back to writing already knowing like being right in the middle of something, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense.
Yeah, and I think like at the end of the book is really like for me making sure like, all the character arcs are fully developed and things like that and really, what how I can make it like a satisfying ending for the readers. And again, but like first drafts, I also know like it's okay if it's not perfect. So, like, my very ending of my book stayed the same, like, through multiple drafts, but, like, what led up to the ending, like, the final climax and things like that actually changed a lot in the editing process. So I think a lot of people say like when I've joined, a lot of like writing groups, critique groups, I've been to conferences and things like that. And a lot of times you always hear people say, just write. Like people say, I'm stuck, and people say, just write. And I know it sounds like really like flip advice, but for me it's like, yeah, just write it and get to the end because I can always go back and fix things. So sometimes I think when we get to the end, we like, oh my gosh, this has to be an earth-shattering ending. It has to be the best ending of all endings. And then we can like take so much time with every little word and every little
Yeah.
thing, and then we never finish because we want this ending to be so perfect. So again, it's like just write an ending because once you have that draft, that's just the beginning. That's the beginning of the exciting editing process, right? But if you
Yeah.
spend so much time trying to get that ending a certain way and it can take so much time. So for me, it's like giving your permission to say, maybe this isn't an earth-shattering ending, but I can always fix that in the revision process.
No, that's perfect. I don't really have anything to add because you just like said it so perfectly. I completely agree about making sure that you want that ending to be good. After a reader spent 300 plus pages with your story, you want them to be like, "Oh my god, that book was so good." Not, "Yeah, it was good, but the end flopped." Like nobody wants that. And so there is a lot of pressure on the ending, but I completely agree with the advice of like just writing. I think that can be for any part of the process at the beginning, middle, or end. If you're stuck on this part and you just like don't know what to do, like just write something and it can be like terrible, or it can be like the beginning of something that you never thought you could write for that chapter, for that story, but but happens to fit, like so I definitely agree with just sitting down and writing and seeing what comes out.
Yeah, and sometimes what I'll do, like, I'm like, "Well, maybe this is the ending." So then I'll write maybe 2, like, alternate endings and then see which one, kinda like I'll start writing, "Well, imagine it goes this way," and then I'll write kind of a draft of that and then draft another way to kinda, like, experiment with which one I kind of like better. So sometimes I'll do that or, like, I'll take out a hunk of something and, like, save it because I don't wanna delete it, and then, write something new and see if I like it better and sit with it for a little while, but knowing that I can always go back, to the other one because I still have it.
Oh, absolutely. Okay, yeah, totally. I am like a huge fan of epilogues and I have them like in all of mine. I love epilogues. And for my thesis novel I wrote in school, I actually wrote two different epilogues and got
Oh,
feedback
interesting.
on like which one people like better. And so having two different endings is totally a really good idea. So now I want to hear about your process drafting The Fragile. If you can give some insight into how long it took you to write it. I think, didn't you say 3 months or was that a different one?
Yeah,
3 months.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So, like, how was it for you? Like, did you feel like you had a smooth time drafting it? Were there any big obstacles you faced?
Yeah, well, this idea, I just, like, woke up with it, like, legit just woke up with the idea, and I knew, like, who the main character was, I knew what was gonna happen, like, I knew a lot of specifics, and so and I just had to write it. Like, I wasn't even thinking, "Okay, I think I wanna write a book." It was just like, I kinda toying around with different ideas over time, and then I just woke up, I'm like, "This is the book I'm gonna write." And so this the Fragile for me, I mean, I've never written a first draft in 3 months, normally it's longer, but, like, for me, it was just the story was so much something I wanted to tell, and I think because I was personally connected to it, it's almost like my story a little bit. And so it was such a personal experience and something I was so passionate about that I just wrote. Like, I remember, like, being in some, like, chat groups and people talking about writer's block. I'm like, "What's that?" Like, any waking moment that I had, like work was a distraction from my book, and making dinner for my family was time I wasn't writing. So, like, whenever I wasn't, working or doing family stuff or other responsibilities, I was working on the book, and I never got stuck. Like, I just wrote because I was passionate about it. But this is not always me. I think it's maybe this book in particular. But again, once I had the draft in 3 months, I spent like a year revising it. And so it was, but it's just that first getting the story out was just really important to me.
Yeah, I love that. And I think you make a really good point of if you feel passionate about an idea, you're going to want to write it. I think sometimes I know I have a couple author friends who it feels like they're trying to pull teeth to write. It's like, oh God, I gotta sit down and write this. I gotta write this. It's like if you're not enjoying it, there's a reason why. Maybe it's, you need a different idea. Once you find that idea that you just like gotta write it and you feel motivated and you're personally connected to it and all of that, it's very, very easy to get into the flow and want to write because that story is in you and it needs out. And I've had the experience too. Like there were quite a few short stories even that I tried to write that I wanted to submit places and I started writing and I'm like, I just have no motivation to do this. Like I don't want to write this right now. And then other times it's like every little bit of time I have between things, I'm scrambling to like get a couple hundred words down. And so I definitely think that the passion for the story contributes a lot to your motivation to draft it.
Yeah, and it's funny, like, I know this might sound weird, but I almost compared it to, like, being in love. Like, when you first meet someone, you're in love, and all you can do is think about that person, and you just wanna be with that person, and it's like, I almost felt like that, like, everything in my life was, like, a time away from working on my book.
Yeah.
But then you also think about in a new relationship, in the first few months, it's all like that, and then it becomes the reality of a long-term relationship
Yeah.
and disagreements. So I almost feel like that with my book. Like, I had that first, love, like, I have to work on this book all the time, and then after in the revision process, there's hard things.
Yeah.
And it wasn't always as fun, but I think the initial getting that draft out there was a really great experience for me.
Yeah, and that is a perfect comparison. You're definitely a writer. It shows. So now that The Fragile is out, congratulations. Can you share with everyone a little about what the book is about?
Yeah. So, um, and it's funny as writers, we always say like the hardest thing for us to write is like that one sentence pitch. So we can write a whole book, but when someone asks us what our book is about, it's like hard.
I don't know.
And I mentioned it's kind of my story in a sense. I identify as like a highly sensitive person. I don't know if you're familiar with like Elaine Aron's work. And also I'm an empath. So I'm really sensitive to other people's feelings, sensitive to the environment and things like that. And in my life, as being a highly sensitive and empathic person, a lot of times I felt like I don't quite fit, like especially in our culture that's really competitive and really individualistic and things like that. And so this book was kind of my way of trying to reframe being really sensitive and empathic as a strength. So in The Fragile, it's like an alternate history where kids actually who are highly sensitive, institutionalized, and they're told something's wrong with them. And so the main character in the book, Maya, is someone who's been institutionalized and she's an empath. She feels other people's feelings. It's really hard for her, but I don't want to spoil anything, but it's about her journey and kind of learning to accept her power. And a lot of other things happen, but that's the gist of it. It's kind of like Maya's story and Maya's her development and learning to accept herself and her own strengths.
I love it. I love it. I love it. Well, congratulations again on your debut.
Thank you.
You're so welcome. So, to wrap up our conversation, what final thoughts do you have on tackling the first draft?
I would really say just try to turn off your inner critic. I know it's hard. give yourself permission to write, to not be worried about every single word. I'm right now working on like a near future sci-fi, and in it, it's like I have this temptation of always, as we talked about every word. But then I actually told myself, write it bad. This is your crappy first draft. Make it as bad as you want it to be. It's okay, write terribly. And it's like I'm telling myself, write it bad. And then I'll write a sentence. Yeah, that sentence sucks. But you know what? I'm going to keep going. So it's almost like you really have to give your permission yourself to say it's okay if it's bad. And I think about someone told me, and I'm probably just paraphrasing this, but there was a situation, like I think it was an art class or something, and they told the students to make mugs. And they told some, make these mugs. You're going to be graded on the quality of your mug. And the other ones are like, you're going to be graded on how many mugs you make. And so at the end of it, the people who would, they're turning out mugs, they're doing 10, 20 mugs, and another person's working, the whole week trying to make one mug. But at the end, the folks who were graded on the quantity actually had higher quality. So it's the more that you do. So if you're stuck there spending one time trying to perfect one thing, you're not actually improving your craft as much as if you just try to do a lot, right? And just keep writing. Like you mentioned short stories, like I write short stories. I do like writing sprints or just things where we practice. And just the more that you write, the better you'll get, which is a better process than just fixating and trying to work on one thing and spend hours trying to make it perfect.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. Oh my goodness. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, it's a joy having you on the show to chat all about first drafts. And this brings us to the plot twist, where I get to ask you a fun question. Are you ready?
Okay. Yes, I'm ready.
If there's one book you could read again for the first time, which book would it be?
Oh, that's a good question for the first time. So I'm kind of a nerd. My favorite book growing up was The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury.
Yeah.
And there's a story in that I really enjoyed, and I think I would read that one.
Awesome. Oh my gosh, yes, I love it. I love it.
Yeah. But for
Awesome.
me, I enjoy if I haven't read something in a while, it almost feels like I haven't read it before, so I don't mind rereading stuff sometimes.
Yeah. No, it's so funny. Like, I always see stuff online where authors will be like, I just read a book I loved, but if you ask me what it's about, I couldn't tell you anything. And that's so relatable.
Yeah, 'cause that's the joy about reading is it just kinda takes you to another place.
Yeah.
And it's I can read a book in a few days just because I get so involved in it, so.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much again for joining me on the show. Can you please share with everybody where they can connect with you online and buy the Fragile?
Yeah, so The Fragile's available on Amazon, Barnes& and Nobles, anywhere where you can buy books. We're actually working on audiobook too, so right now there's
Oh
ebook,
my
paperback. Yeah, and so we're
God.
right now, screening narrators for the audiobooks. I'm excited about that.
My dream.
Um, yeah, and so I'm on Facebook, Instagram. I don't use Twitter that much. But mostly you can find me on Facebook. I also have a website. It's mitradesouza.com, so it's easy to remember. And then you'll have links to my social media there as well.
Fantastic. Oh my God, the audiobook is my complete dream. I am so jealous. That's so
Uh,
fun.
yeah, it's kind of cool to be listening to the narrators right now to choose like who's going to
Yeah.
read it. So it's exciting.
Oh, so cool. Well, congrats again on your release, and thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you, Demi. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. And listeners, that is a wrap on this chat with Mitra all about tackling first drafts. If you enjoyed our conversation, please consider leaving Literary Blend a review and giving it 5 stars to help others just like you discover it. Also, if you have friends in publishing who would enjoy the show, please pass it along to them. Thank you for listening, and until we flip to the next chapter, happy reading and writing.